Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I am Michael Waldman. I'm the president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. We are delighted to welcome you to this Zoom event with many, many people from around the country tuning in to discuss the state of our democracy with one of the leading forces, voices, and leaders in the struggle to maintain the system that we cherish so much. We at the Brennan Center are very pleased to co-sponsor this event with the John Bradamus Center of New York University. The Brennan Center is also affiliated with NYU. I had the privilege of knowing Congressman Bradamus, and he would certainly be very pleased to have our guest today to talk about the Constitution, accountability, and what role Congress can play in upholding our Constitution. Congressman Adam Schiff is here to talk with us about his new book, Midnight in Washington: How We Almost Lost Our Democracy and Still Could. Before we get started, let me just share with you a few housekeeping notes. First of all, we will leave time for questions at the end of this discussion. And if you have a question you would like to ask, please do feel free to add the question via the YouTube chat. And second, we will provide, and we do provide, closed captioning. And I should note that for those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law is a nonpartisan law and policy institute. We work to strengthen, to reform, to revitalize, and when necessary, to defend the systems of democracy and justice in our country. We were started now a quarter century ago as a living memorial to the late Supreme Court Justice William Brennan. And we are deeply engaged ourselves in many of the fights underway all over our country to uphold the values we care about, to engage in some ways in the time-honored, very American tradition of reform, of holding up the institutions of self-government in light of our timeless values. And when those institutions fall short, we work to change it. We at the Brennan Center believe very passionately that right now we are engaged, all of us, in a great fight for the future of American democracy. It's that serious. We all feel that the stresses and strains on our system are significant, that it is under attack in significant ways. And as we learned this year and in years before, those institutions, our democracy, our system is a lot more fragile than a lot of us thought it might be, and certainly than a lot of us wanted it to be. This is a time when history is being written. And when that history is written, I have no doubt that our guest tonight will be a central, significant figure in that history. Congressman Schiff, both as a participant, as a leader, and now as a narrator and an analyst of what is going on. Congressman Schiff represents the 28th Congressional District in California. He is the chair of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, which we will talk about because that over many years has been one of the jewels of the rise of congressional accountability. And I should note that our colleague, Fritz Schwartz, was the chief counsel of the Church Committee in the 1970s that actually helped lead to the creation of the Intelligence Committee and the role that it's played. Congressman Schiff, as we all know, as so many people are well aware, was the lead manager in the first impeachment trial of Donald Trump. Before his time in Congress, he worked as an assistant U.S. attorney in Los Angeles and as a state senator in California. And in addition to this book, Midnight in Washington, he also wrote Impeachment: An Opening Argument. He is speaking to us tonight very generously to talk about this book from Dallas, Texas, where he is out talking to folks about what's going on and about the book. Congressman, on behalf of all of us at the Brennan Center, welcome and thank you for being with us.
Michael, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the extraordinary work done by the Brennan Center to preserve our democracy during these very challenging times. And I must tell you, it's a particular pleasure to join you. As a young law student, I was active with a law school forum, and as a result, one of my jobs was to pick up our guests at the airport and bring them to a dinner before we would have them speak. And I had the privilege of picking up Justice Brennan from the airport. And it was an unforgettable ride as long as it lasted. And I just have such admiration for his service on the bench. And so it's wonderful to be a participant in a very small way in part of that legacy.
Well, that's whenever we hear from anybody who knew Justice Brennan, his daughter is on our board. It means a great deal. He, by all accounts, his personal humanity matched the power of his jurisprudence, and that's very nice to hear. And I've got so many questions about everything that's going on and about this book. I have to say the book is tremendously engrossing. It includes analysis, it includes the grand sweep of history. It also includes some fairly gripping narrative. You really, for example, bring the reader to the floor of the House of Representatives during the insurrection and make the reader feel like they were there. And I must say, it's not a very pleasant place to be. So in that way, you really brought home the horror for so many of us. I guess the first question that I have is the title of the book is Midnight in Washington. It describes the past several years. And my first question really is to you, what time is it right now in Washington and in the country?
Well, that's a very good question. And I picked that title because in part it was the title of a closing argument I gave during the trial, but also because midnight is the darkest hour of every day, everywhere in the world. And yet it is a time of hope. We know that what follows has the prospect of light. Thought that we had crossed through midnight after Joe Biden was elected. I thought we were on the other side of midnight. But then, of course, we had a bloody attack on the Capitol. And even then, I thought in the wake of that terrible tragedy that maybe the country would now be ready, maybe the former president's party would be ready to repudiate Donald Trump and Trumpism and everything that had led to that catastrophe on January 6th. But as it turns out, midnight is still with us. Instead of rejecting Donald Trump and rejecting the big lie that led to the insurrection, Republicans in leadership positions in Congress and elsewhere have embraced the lie that led us there. And so I can't say that we're out of midnight yet, but I am confident through see how it ends, if it ends, but this too shall pass. But what we do right now will determine how quickly it passes and how quickly we move on from midnight. And so I thank you for bringing us together to discuss just what needs to be done to move the country forward.
Well, so why don't we take the lens back just a bit in that, of course, we know that what we're seeing in the United States is not entirely unlike what we see in so many other countries in Western Europe, in Asia, and in the Middle East and elsewhere, a sort of a democratic retrenchment. And if we were having this conversation in 2015 or 2016, when the idea of Donald Trump running for president was novelty, we would be asking then, is Trump a symptom or is he the cause of the surge in ugliness and risk? You argue in many ways that the trend toward authoritarianism began before Donald Trump. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think that there were really two global forces at work that have made the United States and much of the rest of the world really ripe for a turn towards authoritarianism that predated Donald Trump and will continue after he's left the stage for good. The first is how our economy has changed, just how truly global the world economy is now, but also the advent of automation has meant that millions of people at home and abroad have lost their jobs through no fault of their own, and millions of others are at risk of falling out of the middle class. And it's when people not are their poorest that they come to embrace radical solutions or revolution. It's when they are at risk of losing what they have. And I think the last decade has millions of people around the world desperately fearing they're going to lose what they have. And that has provided a ripe environment for the rise of despotism. The other seminal change has been how we get our information. And I know a few of your future speakers will be addressing this, but we moved from a model where when I was a college student, I rushed back to my dormitory to watch Walter Cronkite's last broadcast, a time when there was a large body of agreed upon fact, and we might differ with what to do with those facts, but we could agree on fact. Now people tune into the news they want to hear, or even more so, get their news curated for them through social media. That shows us only what we want to see, and often leads us through algorithms down the darkest of rabbit holes. And so those two forces, profound economic anxiety, coupled with an information environment in which fear and lies and anger traveled virality, were ripe for the rise of a Donald Trump at home and for a Bolsonaro in Brazil or an al-Sisi in Egypt, Erdogan in Turkey, Viktor Orban in Hungary. The list goes on and on. And we need to address those underlying problems. And I do think that what we're doing in Congress right now, with the passage of the rescue plan, with the passage of the infrastructure bill, and with the soon passage of the Build Back Better Act, is a New Deal level investment in the American people to get at one of those two core problems. And that is the economic anxiety facing so many millions of Americans.
Now, of course, in our country, one of the factors to overlay on all of those is our racial division, both the extraordinary demographic change reflected in that we all saw in the census, in the increasing rise of Latino and Black and Asian populations in the United States, but also the backlash to that, drawing on a lot of the ugliest strains in American life. Now, other countries have demographic change of different kinds, but that also does feed into what's going on there. How do you see something like the Build Back Better plan, broad economic policy, as a response to those social divisions, as opposed to more directly focusing on them as a strategic matter as you look in Congress?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. There is certainly a dynamic at work with the rise of this xenophobic populism that is very much focused on race and ethnic origin and national origin. That too is not unique to the United States. Indeed, one of the stories I tell in the book is an early experience in my life when I was with the Justice Department and was asked to serve for half a year in Eastern Europe in Czechoslovakia. And when I arrived, the country was very much whole. And the idea of a velvet or any other kind of divorce was really far from conception. But within a matter of months, I saw a xenophobic populist, someone named Vladimir Mečiar, skillfully blame the other for the woes of Slovaks. Slovakia was experiencing a similar period of tremendous economic churn as that country and others moved away from communism. And suddenly people's economic value, was so disparate from their neighbor. And I saw how Mečiar skillfully used the Hungarian-speaking population as a culprit, the Romani population as a culprit, the Czechs as culprits. And within a matter of months, the country was literally torn apart. And I think that, similarly, we have seen here in Donald Trump a very skillful, shrewd, cynical, and awful exploitation of the other. And this gets back to your first question, which is, yes, there were these global forces and these forces of how we get our information. But with all of that kindling, Donald Trump proved to be the consummate arsonist, the accelerant of those divisions. And In terms of our legislative agenda and its impact, number one, the magnitude of the economic investment in these three bills is, I think, going to be a potent force in undermining, these underlying or diminishing these underlying economic factors, this underlying economic anxiety that has proved such fodder for attacks on the other. But we also have made a very deliberate effort in the Build Back Better legislation to make sure that it is equitable as well as good economics, and that prosperity is shared among Americans. So we try to achieve both objectives in the legislation, and I do think one of the most important things that we can do in its own right for the economic benefit of the American people, but also as part of the democracy agenda.
So one of the things that you write about in Midnight in Washington, the book now on sale all over the country, that has gotten a lot of attention, is what you say about the Republicans with whom you worked. Because those of us who watch the news, those of us who watch cable television, those of us who've watched what's gone on the last several years, only can envision intense partisan combat and jousting as the norm. But you write that you actually, even recently, worked perfectly fine with a number of Republicans, with people in the other party, in a way that would probably surprise many people, even Congressman Devin Nunes. What was it that you were able to do, and what has changed?
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to write the book is there was a lot written by people leaving the Trump White House about the Trump White House. But not much that was written about Congress's role in the enablement of Donald Trump's dismantling of our democratic institutions. And I saw people that I knew well and liked and respected, and liked and respected because I believed that they believed what they were saying, turn out not to believe in what they were saying at all. Or if they did, it simply wasn't as important as their own ambition, as holding the job they had or maybe getting a better job. And I wanted to describe how that happens. The loss of friendships, yes, but also the slow surrender of people's ideology, their ideas, and their morality to the immoral president that we suffered through for 4 years. Prior to Donald Trump, Devin Nunes was not an ideologue. He was what I would describe as a John Boehner country club Republican. In fact, one of the things that he once said, which I repeated quite often, quoted him quite often during the height of the Tea Party movement, he described the Tea Party as lemmings in suicide vests. He got close to the president during the presidential campaign, although he was not, I think, originally a supporter. After the campaign, Trump asked him to serve on his transition team. And he was helping Donald Trump pick cabinet members like Michael Flynn, I understand. When it was necessary for us to begin our investigation, though, he tried to both maintain that cozy relationship with the president while investigating the president. And that exploded in a well-known incident, the Midnight Run. As a result of that, I was compelled to call on him to step down, and he did. That was, as you can imagine, a pretty traumatic change in the nature of our relationship. But even through all of that, and even to this day, we've been getting the work of the Intelligence Committee done. Every year we have passed an Intelligence Authorization Act, a product of our year's worth of oversight, and something frankly very difficult to achieve even under good circumstances because the issues are complicated and they are controversial. But we've done it every year. Indeed, we've done it in years when the Senate Intelligence Committee, which suffered a lot less from partisan brawling than we did, couldn't get it done. And those kind of untold stories do go on. They don't tend to attract much attention. But I do think fundamentally, things are not going to improve for the better in terms of the relationship between the parties as long as that supreme arsonist is on the scene. because he seems quite determined to get up every day to try to find new and even more destructive ways to divide the American people. And frankly, I think his party is still not willing to abandon him, notwithstanding the terrible destruction that he brought. And to give you just one illustration further, you probably saw just 3 or 4 weeks ago, the number 2 Republican in the House, Steve Scalise, on Chris Wallace's Sunday program, asked repeatedly by Wallace, essentially, can you just say that the election wasn't stolen? Can you just bring yourself to speak the words? He asked him 3 times, and Scalise couldn't do it. He couldn't state the plain truth that the election wasn't stolen. And I watched that and I thought to myself, I cannot imagine that Steve Scalise, when he decided to run for Congress some years ago, said to himself, I want to run for Congress so that one day I can be part of a big lie that undermines our democracy. And yet here he is. And yet here he is. And that happens one day at a time. It happens when you're asked to tell a small lie and then a slightly larger one, when you're asked to do something slightly unethical and then more unethical, and pretty soon you're so far in, or you feel your position relies on your continuation of that pattern, that the pattern is set. And that is what has brought us to this point. There's no flaw in the Constitution that I can identify. We shouldn't amend the impeachment clause to make it a majority vote and turn our Congress into a parliament. That's not the problem. The problem is if our representatives don't give meaning to their oath, if they don't inform their decision-making by ideas of right and wrong, if they're not willing to accept the truth, then none of it really works.
Well, what's very striking in what you're saying is just as Trump's rise was not the beginning of the pressures toward an authoritarian response in the United States, this kind of partisanship has been on the rise in Congress and even in the country as well, driven in part, as you say, by the siloed media or echo chamber media environment. But it's really pushed us into new territory in the sense that we have this Madisonian system with checks and balances and multiple veto points on the one hand. And on the other hand, for the first time, 2 very ideologically sorted political parties. The most conservative Democrat is to the left of the most progressive Republican. And we've never had that before. But what you're saying is something even deeper, which is the role of character and self-restraint and morality on the part of leaders to not exploit these situations. Madison also worried that there would be, as he put it in the notes to the Constitutional Convention, that there would be a man of, quote, opulence and ambition who would sway the masses and try to become a dictator, and worries that are not new to this era. How important is the structural stuff, and how important is basic self-restraint and personal character in upholding what we all want to uphold?
Well, they're both important, but I think at the end of the day, the most important is the element of character. If you look at the example of 2 of our members right now, I think it tells you all you need to know about why we are where we are. Liz Cheney refused to carry a big lie that she knew would undermine our democracy. She made the principled decision that she would not do it, that there was something more important to her than keeping her position. And when she said she wouldn't carry the big lie and realized that it would cost her that position, there was someone else in Congress named Elise Stefanik who said, essentially, if she won't carry the big lie, I will. Raised her hand and took her job. The historian Robert Caro once said in an interview, power doesn't corrupt as much as it reveals. It doesn't always reveal us for our best, but it says a lot about who we are. Well, power has said a lot about who Liz Cheney is and a lot about who Elise Stefanik is. And a lot about a lot of other people I serve with in the House and in the Senate, or who took positions of responsibility in the Trump White House. And to me, that is the most important. Now, does that mean that we're powerless to constrain our worst angels? The answer is no. I've introduced a package of reforms, as you know, called the Protecting Our Democracy Act, which I began work on over a year ago after discussing with the Speaker the need for our own set of post-Watergate reforms. And they are measures to strengthen the independence of the Justice Department, protect whistleblowers and inspector generals, stiffen penalties for violation of the Hatch Act, provide an enforcement ability for the Emoluments Clause, expedite congressional subpoenas. All of these things will help, but none of them will be sufficient if people don't honor their oath. I will say this about Madison. After the trial was over, but we had yet to hear the verdict, I know most people are under the impression that it's like a criminal trial where the jury comes in and they announce their verdict. In fact, they're about 3 days after the end of argumentation when senators came to a mostly empty chamber and announced how they planned to vote before there was that roll call. And when Mitt Romney finally took to the Senate floor, all of the others who had been in doubt had already declared their intentions. And I certainly didn't know what Mitt Romney was going to do. I was in the House cloakroom by myself when the staff stuck their head in the door and said, "We're hearing that he's going to convict," and I didn't believe it. I'd heard so many things that proved not to be true. I wasn't ready to believe it. And as Mitt Romney began speaking and cataloging the ills of the president, I was waiting for the inevitable but, because I'd heard that from other senators too, who ultimately got to the point in their rendering a verdict by saying that none of that corrupt conduct was enough to persuade them to convict. But then Romney started talking about his faith, how much it meant to him, and that he'd taken an oath before God. And you could see in how emotional he became just how much that oath meant to him, and talked about his children and his grandchildren and how he realized all the pushback, all the firestorm that he was going to face, but he was going to do it anyway. And he might be no more than a footnote in history, but for any American in the greatest country in the world, that should be enough. And I listened to that beautiful, courageous speech, and I thought to myself, Madison was right to believe that we possess sufficient virtue to govern ourselves, that we don't need to be governed by a tyrant to prevent us from devouring each other. And I believe that to my core. And I ended leaving the trial feeling quite optimistic about the future because of what he did and others who showed great courage. Joe Manchin showed a lot of courage. And Doug Jones similarly showed a willingness to lose his position. There were a lot of heroes that have come out of this last several years whose stories are frankly far more important than the villains.
Well, I want to focus in on three of the great investigations that you've been part of. One is the investigation of the campaign by Vladimir Putin and Russia to influence the election on behalf and in support of Donald Trump, which of course consumed so much attention for a long time. And then of course the impeachment of which you were a part, which focused on the effort by the president to use the power of the U.S. government to blackmail a foreign country into producing dirt to smear an American political opponent. First off, why did you think it was right? You did not support impeachment for the Russia scandal. Why did you think that was not the right move? And how do we look back at all those years and a lot of the feverish speculation and what we now know? How do you assess what in fact happened with Russia and what people should take away from that?
Yeah. Well, Michael, you're absolutely right. I was not an early proponent of impeachment. And you might remember, those of you that watched the trial carefully, that at one point the Trump defense showed kind of a highlight reel of Democrats who'd been calling for Donald Trump's impeachment from his first days in office or his first weeks or months. And I was conspicuously absent from that highlight reel. In fact, I'd written an op-ed in the New York Times, Democrats don't take the bait on impeachment. And my argument in that column was that we ought to let the Russia investigation run its course. We ought to let Bob Mueller do his work. We should let the Intelligence Committee do its work. And when we concluded, evaluate whether the evidence was sufficient to warrant that extraordinary remedy. What made me a convert to the cause of impeachment was the fact that when that investigation, that Russia investigation, came to its conclusion, came to its practical end with the testimony of Bob Mueller, and Donald Trump, watching that testimony, believed that he had finally escaped the jailer for his Russia misconduct. It was the very next day that he was on the phone with Vladimir Zelensky, trying to get help from yet another country to cheat in yet another election. And you can draw a straight line from his failure to be held accountable for his Russia misconduct and his engaging in new and even more severe misconduct. And of course, as a candidate, he could only ask Russia for their help. He could only cover up their help and their campaign's complicity in what the Russians were doing. And let's not forget, in the midst of all the propaganda about no collusion, no obstruction, Donald Trump's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, was secretly meeting with an agent of Russian intelligence and giving that agent repeatedly internal campaign polling data and insights into their strategy in key battleground states, while that agency of Russian intelligence was running a clandestine campaign to elect Donald Trump. But after he felt that he had escaped accountability for Russia, he was now using the power of the presidency to coerce Ukraine into helping him cheat in even more abusive and destructive fashion. So what that said to me was that the greater danger was failing to hold him accountable than using the remedy, even if it meant the remedy would be unsuccessful in the Senate. And I would like to believe that if we didn't persuade the Republican senators, so many of whom were not open to persuasion, I would like to believe that we had an impact on the more important jury, that is the jury of the American people, that made the decision thereafter not to give him another 4 years in office.
Well, and as you recall, that same week of the Mueller testimony and of the phone call to President Zelensky, President Trump told a group of students that the Article 2 of the Constitution gives him the power to do whatever he wants, and that he clearly was interpreting it as a license to commit abuse. When you learned about the phone call, as you write, you were surprised, and it was a real crisis that you and Speaker Nancy Pelosi and others felt they had to manage. Tell those who are watching how you learned about it and what went through your mind and what you had to decide in a very short period of time.
Well, when we became aware of the whistleblower complaint and the fact that it was being withheld from our committee in contradiction of the statutory language that required the Director of National Intelligence to provide the whistleblower complaint to our committee, I called the Director of National Intelligence and demanded an answer, and more than that, demanded the complaint. And when he refused, I told him I was going to haul him before our committee in open session so that he could explain to the American people why he was the first Director of National Intelligence to refuse to turn over a whistleblower complaint to Congress. Now, the whistleblower complaint, in substantial part, but not completely, was about that call between Donald Trump and President Zelensky. I did not believe that the White House was going to voluntarily provide the record of that call. They were stonewalling us on all subpoenas, and vis-a-vis those subpoenas, there was no basis for them to do so. They actually had a not insubstantial claim, respecting a call between two heads of state, why they should be entitled to some confidentiality. So I, wasn't really expecting them to release it. And I think what happened was because we scheduled this hearing with the director, and we were going to force him to answer, and he wanted to release the complaint, and the complaint discussed the call. The White House felt, and the president must have concluded, that if they're going to have to release the complaint, might as well pull the Band-Aid off and release the transcript or record of the call at the same time. And I was in the bunker 3 floors below the Capitol, the place that we call the bunker, the Intelligence Committee, when one of my staff yelled out from the other room, "It's out," meaning the record of the call. And suddenly there were a number of staff in my small office in the bunker. We had handed out copies of the call record, and we were flipping through it. And it was a chorus of holy shits and biblical references and oh my gods. And have you seen this page? And can you believe he said that? And we were astonished. We were astonished in 2 respects. We were astonished about just how brazen it was, how brazen the president's effort to coerce the president of Ukraine into doing his dirty work. But we were also shocked, at least I was, that they would release this, knowing how damning it was. Or maybe the president believed his own propaganda, that it was a perfect call. But it was quite a scene, I can tell you, down in the Schiff.
Well, and the transcript reads, of course, like a David Mamet play or something like that. You know, nice little storefront you have there. Pity if something should happen to it. The impeachment was both compelling and uplifting in making clear to the public what the stakes were, but also a frustrating experience and something that for many of us was unnerving and showing the limits of even the most powerful tool of congressional oversight and accountability. You know, there's now been 5 impeachments, serious impeachment efforts in American history. The Andrew Johnson impeachment, which was not well regarded in history, although a lot of people, I think, are reassessing that a bit because they see it in the context of Reconstruction and the struggle over that. Then, of course, the Nixon Watergate impeachment, which was both well done and won bipartisan support and in effect achieved its results. The Clinton impeachment, and I was President Clinton's chief speechwriter at the time. I'm not a fan of that impeachment, but even at the time, it was considered an inappropriate politicization of impeachment, and it wasn't successful. They didn't didn't receive a majority vote on any of the counts in the House. And then the 2 impeachments of President Trump. And for, you know, when I was younger, Watergate, when I was an early teenager, the notion of impeachment was so awe-inspiring. It was such an extraordinary sanction. The notion of just resisting testimony, resisting subpoenas, just stonewalling impeachment was, even for Nixon, considered way off the table. By the end of the Trump presidency, people just ignoring congressional oversight flagrantly for Trump and his associates was the norm, even in impeachment. And I'm wondering if a consequence of all this is to show the limits of impeachment as a tool of oversight and what that means for compelling the executive branch to participate in oversight generally.
Is a very good question. And I'm sure, Michael, it probably struck you even more with even greater irony and a complete lack of self-awareness than it did me during the impeachment trial, during the first impeachment trial, when the Trump defense team trotted out Robert Ray and Kenneth Starr to talk about the evils of overuse of the remedy of impeachment. It was quite a shock, I have to tell you. But
someone had a sense of humor in their bunker, at least.
So there was only one greater illustration of complete blind-spottedness during the trial when the Trump counsel Hirschman was attacking Joe Biden and Hunter Biden and said that apparently Joe Biden never taught his son not to traffic on the family name. And I remember thinking to myself, Really? You're going to make that argument defending Donald Trump and his family? But in any event, I think more broadly than the danger that impeachment come to be seen as a ineffectual remedy is the danger that Congress's oversight altogether be viewed as completely toothless. This is why the enforcement action by the Justice Department of the subpoena of the criminal contempt referral of Steve Bannon is so important. Imagine a court that had no power to enforce its subpoenas. It wouldn't be a court. And a Congress that can't enforce its subpoenas is no longer a Congress. It's becomes a plaything in the hands of any despot. And that, to me, is the more immediate danger, that Congress lose any power of oversight. I do think that the Justice Department will follow through and prosecute Steve Bannon. They've made the decision to not assert executive privilege over any of this information, which I think is obviously the right decision, but not an easy decision, because I'm sure the Biden administration, like every presidential administration, wants to protect executive prerogative, and they realize that their own communications could one day be subject to disclosure following that precedent. But they also understand that if there's ever a circumstance where the balance needs to tip in favor of oversight, it's where the Congress itself and our democracy is attacked. But it would make little sense to take that position and then refuse to enforce it. And so it is my hope, it is more than my hope, it's my expectation that the Justice Department will follow through and prosecute Steve Bannon. If they don't, then we can't truly say that no one is above the law anymore. It would mean effectively that if you're a friend of the former president or you're at a position of power and influence, that you can ignore a subpoena. And so my most pressing worry is, frankly, the oversight power itself. And I think that the power to impeach is a corollary to that. I always felt, and it's not an argument that I made often during the impeachment, because the Ukraine misconduct was so much more viscerally impactful, that Article 2 of the impeachment, the obstruction of Congress, was in the long term perhaps even more important, because if a president could show they could simply stonewall subpoenas indefinitely, then it would fundamentally alter the balance of power and for good. And so your question is a good and as yet unanswered one about the impeachment remedy, but more proximate, it's an unanswered question as to our very oversight power.
So we're getting quite a few questions from those watching, and I want to share some of them with you. One question from those who are sort of following this in the news, reading about what goes on in Washington, wondering what they can do, is what can citizens, as we're looking in a variety of ways at trying to bring some accountability for what's going on, what can citizens do? And I should say, I see the congressman. I don't know if the congressman can hear me, but we are having some technical problems. And while I know my colleagues at the Brennan Center are working to resolve them, I want to again remind everybody that we are talking with Congressman Adam Schiff, who generously is joining us from Dallas, Texas. We're talking about his book, Midnight in Washington: How We Almost Lost Our Democracy and Still Could. It is a very compelling book, again, not for specialists, for anybody who's interested in this great fight for democracy. And I do want to read from it. One of the passages that I thought summed it up quite well, which is right near the beginning of the book. It says, "There is now a dangerous vein of autocratic thought running through one of America's two great political parties. And I do want to ask the congressman when we restore our connection about this. It poses an existential danger to the country, he says, but in this we are not alone. Congressman, we are we're doing a reading from your book while we're getting the technology fixed up. I don't know if you can hear me.
You managed to pull it up?
What the book says is the actions of our government, like the broader sweep of history, are not on their own, and they are not the product of impersonal forces operating without human actors and agency. As you described, we made Donald Trump possible. We, the voters, yes, but we in Congress even more so. He would not have been able to batter and break so many of our democratic norms had we not let him. Had we not been capable of endless rationalization, had we not forgotten why we came to office in the first place, had we not been afraid. How does that happen? How do good people allow themselves to be so badly used? Congressman, I don't know if you can hear me or your own words.
I can hear you. Are you able to hear me again?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the show must go on, and thank you for improvising. The question that the audience had is, what can citizens do who are not in Congress, who don't have subpoena power, to fight fascism, as the questioner asked, and protect democracy?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. And I needed to pause to find an even more unflattering angle, and I think I've done it. I think that the most severe threat to our democracy right now is what's going on around the country, in which not only are Republican legislatures disenfranchising people of color, but they're also stripping independent elections officials of their duties and giving them over to partisan boards and legislatures. And Republican activists, MAGA technocratic running independent elections officials, technocratic elections officials out of town with death threats and other pressure. The lesson that Donald Trump and his supporters seem to have learned from the failed insurrection is that if they couldn't find a Secretary of State in Georgia who would essentially stuff the ballot box with 11,780 votes, that next time they would find someone who would. And to me, that is the gravest danger. And I would put very high on the priority list in terms of what people can do is to push back in every way possible against these disenfranchisement laws and to rally around these independent elections officials, some of which are elected, some of which are not. They're local, very local elections officials who frankly are unwilling, some of them, to do the job again because they didn't sign up for this. They didn't sign up for the threats. They didn't sign up for the intimidation. And those of you who are watching who are lawyers can donate your legal time and skills to fighting these disenfranchisement efforts, and those who are activists can try to defend those who do the day-to-day conduct of our elections to protect them. I would put that very much at the top of the list, but I would also say that don't try to do everything. It's paralyzing to look at everything going wrong and decide there's nothing that can be done about it. Nothing more demoralizing than the sense that you're powerless to affect your condition or the condition of our country. And the reality is you're not powerless. I would just figure out, okay, what's the one thing that I can do in the next year to help preserve our democracy? Because the reality is we can all do something. And that's what will get us through this. The reason that I'm an optimist, all evidence to the contrary.
Well, we've got a frozen picture again, and again the congressman is an optimist. So that Congressman, one of the questions that we have relates to, in a sense, to what you said about the challenge of disinformation, of the role of social media, and the media environment, not only do we not have a Walter Cronkite who everybody believes is speaking something close to the truth, but we have polarized media, but also sources of information that are simply just filled with lies and dangerous lies. And interestingly, some of this seems to be alarming people across the political spectrum. How should Congress approach social media regulation while also respecting the First Amendment?
Yeah. Well, of all the damaging, of all the really discouraging revelations about Facebook in the last few months, of which obviously there've been a great many, the one that concerned me the most, the one that I found the most fraught, was the effort by an internal researcher within Facebook who created essentially a fake Republican woman, and gave her very few attributes. They made her, I believe, a watcher of Fox. They made her a Christian, and they made her a mother. And with that criteria and little else fed into their algorithm, what the Facebook algorithm spit back was QAnon content. It immediately took her down a QAnon rabbit hole. And that is so enormously chilling. And my feeling is that if the social media companies no longer use their immunity from liability to be good moderators of content, and the very purpose of that Section 230 was to encourage them to moderate content, to take down things that were dangerous or divisive or hateful, and not to protect them if they didn't, but to protect them from suit if they did. And if they're not going to use that, if they're going to continue to set their algorithms to amplify for engagement, in other words, to amplify for anger and fear and hate and bile, then they should lose their immunity. Or at a minimum, that immunity should be confined to a safe harbor in which they're not amplifying for engagement. The broader problem, though, is, let's say that worked. What about Fox Primetime? What about the fact that Tucker Carlson, who is, and I know this sounds oxymoronic, but he's the thought leader of the Republican Party right now. He is extolling Viktor Orban, the Hungarian wannabe dictator, as the model for the Republican Party. CPAC is hosting their convention, one of their conventions in Budapest, because this is now to be celebrated. And I think what's gone on in Hungary is the same danger we face here, which is the instruments of democracy itself are used to attack the democracy. And so these are the challenges we face. And I do think that there are some answers vis-a-vis social media. There aren't very good answers vis-a-vis the Newsmaxes and the OANs. We don't, they're not using broadcast airwaves alone such that they can be subject to a new fairness doctrine. And to me, this is one of the most difficult and potentially insoluble problems. I think we're going to have to teach ourselves how to be good consumers of information again in this new and very hazardous information environment.
I want to ask a few questions related to the current effort for oversight that have come from the audience. Congressman Ted Lieu and others have pushed for bills or changes to rules to increase the effectiveness of Congress's subpoena powers. As we all watch the challenge of trying to do this on the January 6th committee, are there things Congress can do to increase its ability to enforce subpoenas? And I want to combine that with a question from a Brennan Center colleague. As you do this kind of investigation, which inevitably, in this case, involves the actions of private citizens, not just government officials, how can you aggressively investigate while protecting people's constitutional rights and avoiding overreach?
Well, in terms of what remedies we have, the reason why we decided to go in the first instance regarding Steve Bannon to the Justice Department is that prosecution was both the most expeditious route, presuming that the Justice Department acts expeditiously, and that a criminal process also, while likely to be swifter than civil litigation, would have the most powerful deterrent effect. And I think it has. Even prior to the Justice Department acting, the fact that Steve Bannon has been referred for prosecution has gotten the attention of a lot of other witnesses, I believe, and encouraged their cooperation, or at least their non-obstruction. And so I think it's already had an important impact. Now, should the Justice Department not prosecute, it will have exactly the opposite impact. But at the moment, I think it's having a very positive impact. Now, that may not be the remedy we use with everyone. And we may revive our power of inherent contempt. But what people should understand, I think, about inherent contempt is that's not a simple or expeditious answer either. We don't have a jail like we used to. If we were to build a jail or rent a jail and send out the sergeant at arms to arrest somebody and put them in that jail, there would be undoubtedly habeas corpus litigation. And we would have to litigate that. If we used our inherent contempt power to fine someone, which is an approach that I particularly like, fine someone $5,000 or $10,000 a day until they comply, we would have to go to court to garnish their wages. And so I wish that I could say there was a simple and expeditious answer. All of them have their own difficulties. But I think the very best, at least with respect to our first obstructor, is to seek prosecution. And but we are not by any means foreclosing the use of these other remedies.
And we at the Brennan Center are nonpartisan. You are in an intrinsically more partisan environment. You mentioned Liz Cheney and the courage, the real courage that she and a few others have showed in standing up for democracy and really losing something meaningful in the process. There are certainly voices outside Congress on the right. Robert Kagan's recent op-ed, for example, in the Washington Post, he's a well-known neoconservative scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, saying the constitutional crisis is now. And the never Trumpers, it's kind of easy to kind of wonder how big a force they are. But if you look at states where people voted for Republican House members but voted for Biden for president, they actually played a pretty significant margin of victory role in a place like Wisconsin in this last election. Your job is not really to prognosticate on the other party, but unless there's a faction of the Republican Party that is willing to stand up for democratic norms, we have a two-party system, and tribalism will take hold, and sooner or later, one party or another is going to win. What do you think are the odds that there will be a force for standing up for these constitutional values in both parties?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think I neglected to answer the second part of your last question about the First Amendment and how do we ensure that we don't overreach. And I think the simple answer is we don't overreach. We be very careful. We be very judicious in how we use our compulsory process. We wait until we have all the evidence before we decide whether to use any of the remedies we have if members of Congress are implicated in the January 6th insurrection more than their act of insurrection themselves in voting to overturn the election. So I think we have to be very, very judicious about every step we take, recognizing that the other party will be more than likely to abuse any precedent we set. In terms of the future of the Republican Party, I would like to believe that Liz Cheney represents that future. a Republican Party that is once again a party of conservative ideals. The question is that future proximate or is that future in the far distance? There isn't much sign at present that it's very near. And one thing that I think would help a great deal is if some very prominent people got off the sidelines, and chiefly George W. Bush and George W. Bush world. Now, I realize that he has made statements from time to time, and there are people within that world who have spoken out, but not as much, not nearly as much as they need to. And yes, it runs contrary to the precedent of former presidents don't critique current presidents, but we're not living in that world anymore. And Donald Trump is destroying their party and destroying their legacy along with his own. And I think it would accelerate the transition away from this Trumpist party back to a Republican party. I do think you're right about your diagnosis. Donald Trump is following a playbook that I think you see other autocrats use. Turkey's Erdogan comes to mind with me. Years ago, you might recall when Erdogan was running for re-election, there were audio tapes played on Turkish radio with him on the phone with his son, saying the police are coming, hide the money, hide the money. And his son, I think, was on the phone saying, don't worry, Dad, we've hidden all but about 32 million. I don't even think that Erdogan tried to deny it. He blamed the Jews in the West for being out to get him. But the more substantive defense, if you will, if there was one, was not something he said explicitly, but I think it was implicit in what he would say. And it was, yes, he's a crook. They're all crooks, but he's their crook. And I think that's Donald Trump's message. Donald Trump believes that everyone lies because he lies so pathologically. Donald Trump believes that everyone is a crook because he's a crook. And he sees himself in everyone else and can't imagine it otherwise. And I think his message to his followers is, yeah, he's a crook, but they're all crooks and he's their crook. And the only way to get past that is if the Republican Party becomes a party of ideas again and not simply being hostile to the Democratic Party and hostile to our democracy and a cult around a single human being.
I have one last question or compound question, as the lawyers would note, relating to what we can do about this moment. As you know, as many in the audience know, the Brennan Center is deeply engaged in the fight for national legislation to address some of these dangers to our democracy. You described the Protect Our Democracy Act, which is very important in restoring checks and balances. As we know, there are two critical pieces of legislation now before the Congress to deal with the threats to our electoral system. And in many ways, it is a great political clash of our time, in that you've got states rushing forward to suppress the vote, and as you described, to change who counts the votes, election voter suppression joined by election subversion in a really terrifying way. And states are rushing forward to do this. And at the same time, Congress has the power to do something about it, to stop it in its tracks. It has the power constitutionally, has the power legally. The question is, does it have the political will? H.R. 1, the legislation, its successor bill, is now known as the Freedom to Vote Act in the Senate. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, both passed the House of Representatives. H.R. 1, for example, would be, and even in its trimmed down version in the Senate, would be the most significant democracy reform legislation in half a century, at least. And it would address the very things you talked about, the insurrection that's still going on. It passed the House, both of them. They're both tremendously popular. Both have now a majority support in the Senate, and both are running into a wall of obstruction in that chamber where you spoke during impeachment with the Senate rules and the obstruction by Republicans through the filibuster of these vital pieces of legislation. And time is wasting. The gerrymandering that is going on all across the country as states draw district lines is happening today. It's happening right now. Many other things are happening right now. And unless something is done soon, it will be really hard to reverse so much of the damage. What do you think needs to happen in the Senate? And what can we do to try to maximize the chance that the national government will step up as it has at other moments in American history when there's been abuse?
Yeah. Well, if this is the last question, let me address two themes in it, if I can. The first you asked about, and the second is another danger that I see, and that is the failure, if that's what we're witnessing, of the Justice Department to investigate the former president's potentially criminal misconduct. But first, let me talk about voting rights. Michael, I completely agree with you that these two bills, H.R. 1 and the John Lewis Act, are existential to our democracy. I don't think a democracy can long thrive or maybe even survive if over a sustained period of time it is governed by a minority of its citizens. And through the gerrymander, the House is often controlled by a minority of Americans. Because the Senate is unrepresentative of much of the country, since 23% of rural voters control 60% of the votes in the Senate is already unrepresentative of the majority. You add a filibuster on top of it, it's even more unrepresentative of majority. The Electoral College means that the President of the United States is often someone who is not elected by a majority of Americans. And finally, the most unrepresented body is the Supreme Court, by virtue of what Mitch McConnell has done in withholding a nominee from one president and jamming through a nominee for another. And so these two bills, I think, are the most important effort in a generation to attack those problems. And I felt a sense of urgency from day one. I don't know whether that sense of urgency was sufficiently widely shared, because we are now very well along in the process of gerrymandering. But I think there's only one pathway to getting it done, and that pathway runs through Joe Manchin. I say Joe Manchin because I don't think Kyrsten Sinema will be an island if Joe Manchin can be brought along. And I find her position much more difficult to understand. But it was my sense during the impeachment trial, in getting to know Joe Manchin a bit, that if we could persuade him that the president was both guilty and a threat to the country, if we could persuade him in terms that he could explain back home, that he would vote to convict, and he did, which was an act of great courage. Donald Trump won West Virginia by far more than he won Utah, probably by about 30 points. And convincing someone they should vote against the president that won their state by that margin is a very difficult burden to carry, but we did. And I think the key on voting rights is to make the case to Joe Manchin sufficiently that he believes he can make the case back home, that nothing short of carving an exception to filibuster will protect people's right to vote. And I'm hoping, although I can't tell you that I know this for a fact, but I'm hoping that what has been happening in the Senate by taking up these bills and seeing them fail to garner sufficient Republican support, and of course they never will, is part of showing Joe Manchin that there is no pathway to doing this in a bipartisan manner. No amount of changes to H.R. 1, no matter of changes to the John Lewis bill will be sufficient to gain bipartisan support, because Mitch McConnell's whole business model now is disenfranchising people. They know their ideas are unpopular, and increasingly so. And their only hope of attaining power and keeping it is if fewer Americans vote. And so that's the only path that I can see. And frankly, the only way it's going to happen is if Joe Biden personally spends his time on this task and does so intensively. I don't think these efforts to attack Joe Manchin or embarrass him or confront him in the garage. I don't think any of that is productive. But I do think it would be productive. I hope and pray it would be productive to show him why this is so vital to his own constituents and help him explain it back home.
I'm duty bound to note that those are not our supporters on this bill who confronted Senator Manchin in that way. These bills are the Freedom to Vote Act. Now he is a lead author of it and actually was very engaged as the former Secretary of State of West Virginia in crafting it and changing it in ways that he thought improved it. But he will have to face a choice between voting rights and Senate obstruction. And there are ways, of course, to pass it that retain the filibuster. I don't think there should be a filibuster, but you can nevertheless pass this while retaining that rule, but nevertheless making it in a variety of different ways so that we can save the vote and save democracy right now. And we certainly agree that as for President Biden, I was at the National Constitution Center when he spoke in July about this. And he said that he thought this was the greatest threat, all of this, to American democracy since the Civil War. And they were powerful words, but from him and others in Congress, we need action to match that. Congressman, we are out of time. And we are so grateful to you for being here with us to talk about your book, Midnight in Washington, how we almost lost our democracy, and significantly, and as we have just been describing, how we still could, and how I guess I would say we could also save our democracy. And I want to thank my colleagues at the Brennan Center for Justice. We have other events coming up. And we want to thank our colleagues at the John Bradamus Center at NYU. As I mentioned again, those of us who had the privilege of knowing Congressman Bradamus know how much he would appreciate the argument for strong Congress that we've heard tonight. I am Michael Waldman. Again, I'm the president of the Brennan Center. And I ask anybody who's new to the organization, new to these events, please stay in touch with us. Stay up to date on the issues affecting our systems of democracy and justice. We have weekly newsletters, weekly analysis. Please sign up for the briefing newsletter. It's for experts, as we put it. It's no spam, lots of footnotes. And we look forward to including you all at our next event on November 16th, which is how social media violates the social contract, with former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick and other people. And please do register for that and other events at brennancenter.org/events. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for being part of this great movement for democracy that has to prevail if we're going to save our country. And again, thank you, Congressman, for this book and for what you've been doing. And good night,
Thank you, Michael.
everybody.